adolescent mental health. But we've been working more specifically on partnerships around this topic between schools, families, community partners, and we're really excited to share our work with you all. So my name is Patrick Cunningham, and I'll let Dr. Saranovski introduce himself first, actually.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. So I'm Brent Saranovski. Thrilled that you all are here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Those of you that are just joining us, we're excited that you've chosen to come to our session. Please do use the chat generously throughout for questions that you have or to create a conversation amongst ourselves. Those of you that are posting hello and that's the kind of energy we need. So keep doing that. We're excited to kind of enhance the narrative around this work. Those of you that have not, I have not had the pleasure of meeting before, I'm excited to meet you. I am the founder of a national conference called the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference. The mission of that conference is to really disseminate what works to break down inequity, lack of access, to help with mental health issues, social emotional issues, academic issues that are barriers to student success in schools. And we really value our school partners and district partners and family partners in that work and higher ed partners. So, Mary, definitely sounds exciting. We'll have to keep connecting on community hubs and the way that we connect across support services in schools and families. That's very exciting. So as Patrick mentioned, I've been doing work around this, the efforts to buffer trauma and also attack the systems that create trauma for our most marginalized and underrepresented populations throughout my career. It's one of my passion areas. And so I'm just thrilled to be here with Patrick supporting his work with the Ohio State Family Engagement Center, and I appreciate his invitation to be here.
All right, and I'm Patrick Cunningham. As I said before, I am a doctoral candidate in the Counselor Education Department at Ohio State, and I'm also a graduate research associate with the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center. So I spend a lot of time in the world of family engagement, and I've been so fortunate to be a member of the team at the Statewide Family Engagement Center, and to be working on this specific project around mental health. You know, time and time again, when talking with folks from schools, folks from the community, family members, one of the main concerns that we're hearing over and over again at the Statewide Family Engagement Center is around mental health. And, what can we do to support children and adolescent mental health? It truly is a really, really huge concern at the moment. And it has been for a few years, even before the pandemic. It's just become a major focus. And I think rightfully so. We'll talk a lot about some of the statistics that we're seeing with students. And so, that was before the pandemic. It was becoming a major focus. And now things are even more heightened since the pandemic. So I have a background in school counseling as well. I am working on my dissertation at the moment, so I've been very busy. But also, Dr. Saranovski and I and a few other members from the Statewide Family Engagement Center have been working on developing resources for schools and for families around partnerships to support student mental health. So we're really excited to share with you all today. So this is a little bit of information on what we've been doing. So it started with a really in-depth literature review. We're just kind of doing our best to dive into what research is telling us about the state of mental health for students, having to do with things like trauma, having to do with things like protective factors, like we'll talk about in a little bit. And then, what are effective strategies that we can all be using in partnership with one another to help build supports for students around, really promoting their mental health. So we developed a research brief where we kind of did our best to distill some of these really, really big topics and focus it in a bit more and to focus on some really high impact strategies around mental health for partnerships between schools and families. And this research brief, the audience for it really is educators. So while we do include strategies for families in there, the emphasis really is on educators. So I see Farah has already dropped the link in the chat for you all. And so please, yeah, it's free to access. Please use it, share it, send it out to anyone that would be interested, because we're really hoping to support schools in their efforts to build partnerships around this area. And now we're in the next stage of the project, which is really trying to focus on helping everyone to implement these strategies. So what can we do to support families? What can we do to support schools in actually taking these strategies and putting them into action? And that is really exciting work and really challenging work. So not only are we excited to share with you all today, but we're really excited to hear from you all, because I think the conversation we have, especially toward the end of today's workshop, can really help inform the work that we're going to be doing moving forward. So we're really excited to hear with you all as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to let Dr. Z kind of jump into kind of setting up the conversation for us all today.
Thanks, Patrick. And I'm excited. We have 60 people here. And so the wisdom in this virtual room is going to be incredibly impactful to this work. You've all come to a workshop, so that has literally the word work in it. So we are going to work together in about an hour to enhance this and take this deeper and apply it to our own settings. And even evolve the work. And so please be patient with us here for about 20, 30 minutes as we kind of set the frame for why this is important. If you have attended any of our sessions, Patrick or my sessions in the past, then this first activity is going to be familiar to you. However, we've updated a lot of the data for you, and there's going to be an additional kind of learning experience afterwards. So don't leave us if you're like, oh, I've been here, I've done this. It's just the way that, we like to frame the understanding of what's going on. We are hoping our agenda is going to be that we are starting off with understanding and framing this issue on a national level and on our local levels around what we know from data and from student voice and from some family and school counselor and administrator voice early on. And then we're going to move into what do we do to help kids buffer the impact of this stress and anxiety and other mental health issues that have doubled during the pandemic? Doubled. That is correct. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And by the way, for you adults, our other adults that we do have data that shows that anxiety has increased around 300% in the pandemic for adults. And so when we're working with other people, when we're working with other adults, make sure we give them grace and empathy, because we know people are struggling. And it's not just our kids that are struggling, our adult leaders are struggling. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. And then again, at the end, we're going to spend about an hour together workshopping. And so if you hang with us, you're going to be able to contribute and evolve and take away things that you'll be able to apply, hopefully, on Monday. When you go back to wherever your environment that you're working. So we want to make this very practical for you. So welcome. If you're new to our work, welcome. We're excited that you're here. We hope you find it very practical, attainable, easy to implement, and we look forward to collaborating with you.
And one thing I'll just jump in and add really quickly, Dr. Z, is we want this to be as interactive as possible. So while all of your cameras are off, we still want to hear from you. So please use the chat, jump in, and if we see something in the chat, we'll try to talk about it right away as well. So feel free to jump into the chat and interact as much as possible, and we'll try to facilitate that as well.
Absolutely. All right. So again, if you've been with us before, we like to start with this to kind of frame the conversation. But if you've not, this is an activity that I have been doing since over a year now, year and a half, asking participants, no matter where I'm working. So I have a lot more data than we were going to share, anecdotal data from participants doing workshops across the country. What mental health or social emotional impacts are you seeing as a result of the pandemic? And as much as we want it to be over, it's still with us, on students and adults in schools and families with which you work. So if you have a phone, you can just use the QR code right there. The Menti is also going to be put into the chat, the link, the Menti link. That's a direct link right there. And I think Patrick just, Patrick, do you want to throw that link in there too? And if you can go directly to the link, and then, or use the QR code. The mics are all turned off, I believe, Joan, just so you know, but the chats, is a way that you can work. And if we get that QR code, we're going to go away from the QR code in about 30 seconds. So you can use the direct link that Patrick just dropped into the chat if the QR code doesn't. Then what we will do is show you what is our results on our Mentimeter. Now, those of you that have done a word cloud before, you know that the more you write a word, the bigger it is in the middle of the screen. So you have 3 entries, and you can submit as many entries as you want. So when you see somebody else and you're like, oh my gosh, yes, lack of social skills, burnout, I didn't even think about that, but that I'm seeing everywhere, then type it in, because we want you to reiterate, reinforce, emphasize, highlight the things that you're seeing, even if you didn't see it, or if you didn't write it initially. If you see it on the screen and you're like, definitely, I see that, go ahead and write it in again, because it'll make it bigger and bigger, and we will crowdsource what people are seeing. So far we see that overwhelmingly people are seeing anxiety, an increase in anxiety and depression and stress, lack of social skills, feelings of burnout, disconnection, anger. If you've gone to any of our sessions on hope, then you'll know that anger is often a primary indication of a lack of hope, and we can actually build hope. And Patrick is actually being an expert in that pretty soon. So we can talk more about that in another session. So we see isolation, lack of motivation, exasperation, leaving their careers. Yes, we know that there have been educators that have and nurses in schools that have simply walked out and have been basically done. And that's probably as a result of fear and burnout and frustration and some of the fatigue and stress and anxiety and depression, the things that you're listing here. We often talk about them as if they are impacting just our kids, just our students. And we know that it impacts us. So we see about 27 contributors, and we know there's about 60 something more of us. I know that some people are answering in the chats. And if you can take what you put in the chat, then we can put it into the word cloud, and we can also kind of add that later. But overwhelmingly, we see that people are feeling, according to us, the people in the room, 27 people who contributed, overwhelmingly feeling anxiety, depression, stress, fear, and a lack of social skills. So let's keep that in mind. In fact, I'm going to write that into our chat. Like, the major themes that we're seeing are anxiety, depression, burnout, lack of social skills, anger. Did I get stress, fear, withdrawal, isolation and withdrawal. All right. So these are some major themes. And so we're going to keep that in mind as Patrick takes us back to the presentation. And I will close that and stop my sharing so that Patrick can go back and start his sharing. And what we're going to notice is that no matter where I go and who I talk with across the country, it's very similar themes to what you all have identified. We know that we had 179 school and clinical counselors at a conference that we did the same type of intro activity. And you can see they identified a lot of issues, a lot of interconnected issues. But again, overwhelmingly, what's that number one issue? Anxiety. Number 2, depression. 3, burnout, isolation. So if you look at your themes, our mental health experts in schools are seeing the exact same things with children and adults that we're working with. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we did this in another state with just counselors, just school counselors. Again, same thing. It doesn't matter if you're in Kentucky, Ohio, California, New York, Florida. People are going to be feeling anxiety and stress, depression, burnout, feeling overwhelmed. We have evidence of that from national data. We also have this anecdotal data. If you keep going, Patrick, we'll see that we asked administrators, these are in California, we had 114 superintendents, district office leaders, administrators at the school level, so principals, APs. We had some district lead of school counselors, but this was really a conference that was only for administrators. And what they saw was really the exact same themes. We also did this, we've done this multiple times at the Ohio State Family Engagement Center at different workshops. And so we highlight, and there's more than what I've shared here, but we're just highlighting kind of that it really doesn't matter who that you're talking to. If we're talking to families, parents, educator, leaders, community members, counselors, clinical mental health counselors that are working in schools with wraparound services. It doesn't matter who we're talking to. Everybody is experiencing and seeing the same emotional and mental health impacts of the pandemic, with increases in anxiety, isolation, depression, burnout, all the things that you all listed. So that is really the impact of living in our pandemic world. And we see this impact especially for populations that have been historically marginalized or oppressed. This is a summary from the Department of Education that they posted based on their research and data across the country through the pandemic years. And they observed 11 things. We want to make sure you had it on one slide. Feel free, by the way, anytime that you see a little blue link mark up on the top right corner here of this slide, that means that we've tried to link this so that you can use this resource. Our hope and goal for any workshop or presentation that you attend where Patrick and I or that I'm leading in any way or participating is that you take our stuff. We want you to take this. We want you to use this. And so if you feel like this could be helpful in your setting, this being slides, data, research, please use them. Of course, please cite the Ohio State Family Engagement Center when you do that, and so that you give credit for the slides. I would just use maybe the way that they're built right now with the background. However, things like the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, that is open access. That is not our property. So please take the link, use the content. We hope it helps educate others. Because if you look through this, what you're going to notice, academic growth has been impacted, but you're going to notice with the other observations, they are equity and access observations, oftentimes oppressive. Oftentimes inequity has been increased. And you'll notice that especially observation 5, we have LGBTQ populations, we have BIPOC populations, observation 10, we have Asian American Pacific Islander in observation 8. We have populations that are facing increased oppression as a result of the pandemic. We also have abuse and violence increasing. We also know that sexting has increased. This isn't on this slide, but we know that sexting has increased during the pandemic. And I think that when we talk about the trends that you are seeing around anxiety, depression, burnout, isolation, we know isolation is actually a medical issue. Isolation, a feeling of loneliness, leads to increases in generalized anxiety, social anxiety. And so there's not really surprising to me that sexting has increased as our teens reach out for some sort of connection, some sort of lifeline to others to feel seen. And so I think that now more than ever, we see that what has existed before the pandemic and has existed in our country really since the founding of it has only been laid bare and exacerbated even to a greater level. We can keep going, Patrick. So as I mentioned, if you've been with us before, you will notice that some of the data or some of the activities maybe we brought forward, but this is new data for you. So again, feel free to use this data, take it with you. But this data really just reinforces the mental health risks and the mental health needs of our youth right now. We know that across the world, anxiety and depression has doubled during the pandemic. We know, for example, in Brazil, about 20% of students are expressing feeling anxiety, so 1 in 5. We know that, as I mentioned before, we have a general increase in the United States in anxiety in students for about 266%. And in the United States, for adults, 300% increases in feelings of anxiety. We also know from the data, if you look at the bottom, Yard and colleagues looked at the data for emergency room visits, and emergency room visits were up 51% for adolescent girls. That 4% for adolescent boys is concerning in the sense that we know that attempts for girls are higher than for boys in the sense of not successful attempts. Boys tend to use very violent means to attempt suicide and are more successful at a higher rate. And so the 4%, it doesn't mean that our adolescent boys aren't experiencing more anxiety, depression, and suicide attempts. It could simply mean that those that are attempting are successful. So we could have that data as well. So we know that our kids are, as you mentioned, feeling sad and hopeless and isolated and anxious. And we know that not just from our anecdotal experiences, our personal experiences, but we know worldwide and in our own country that this is true from data. If you have any questions or thoughts, any emotional response to this or thoughts about this, please put them in the chat. Farrah's kind of doing the major takeaways, which is really nice because sometimes, as I'm talking, I forget what my major takeaways are. So Farrah's tracking that for us. But if you have thoughts and emotions and feelings, please also contribute. We'd love to hear from you. One of the things that's a priority for us, and those of you that work in schools and work with social emotional learning, one of the priorities for social emotional learning should always be student voice. If we don't have student voice and family voice, then it's not really social emotional learning. It's just adults in a school trying to control kids' behavior. That's very different things. So we really prioritize student voice. This is one of my favorite resources for student voice. Again, the link's here. Please feel free to explore it. And what you're going to see is that before the pandemic, they had almost 500,000 contributions to surveys from students. 500,000. During the pandemic, they have about 300,000. And so we have this really nice, robust data set of pre-pandemic and during pandemic feedback from kids in grades 3 through 12. And what the kids have said, and this is just a little skim of what they said, is that overall, the number one barrier to their success through the pandemic has been their social, emotional, and mental health needs, and if they are not being met. The other obstacles that we see are inequity, which we kind of pointed out from the data from the Department of Ed, teacher support, feeling respected, and plans for the future. And we know that post-secondary enrollment has decreased during the pandemic, especially again for our most marginalized and underrepresented populations. Those students are applying less often during the pandemic. The other thing that our students said is that of these students that participated, which is 300,000 during the pandemic, about half of them said that feeling depressed, stressed, or anxious has increased to becoming the number one barrier to making it be difficult to do their best in school. If you look again at the other barriers, you're going to see a lot of these are kind of natural inequities that we pointed out. When I say natural, they happen across the United States in the sense that we all thought, oh, we're going to go online during the pandemic. Well, of course, that lays bare inequities around limited or no internet access, technology. A lot of people struggled, especially from our Black and brown populations, because oftentimes people in poverty were our frontline workers, whether it be, and we know some people like in the state of Georgia, the governor identified early on frontline workers, and for some reason identified hairstylists and other populations that they went and looked across the data and identified as primarily Black and brown jobs, not careers, but jobs, and that were the jobs that were identified as frontline. In other words, forced to go back to work during the pandemic. And so what my point is that the number 3 identification here is the health or health of family members. And so a lot of our students, our oppressed, marginalized students saw family members die. And we're dealing with the grief of this as people were asking them to come back to school, recover your grades, do credit recovery, and things like that. And so we're dealing with a lot of mental health issues, the depression, anxiety, stress, isolation that you all mentioned, as well as grief and loss and anger and frustration and all sorts of other things that come with seeing family members die as a result of the pandemic. We keep going. I I tend to struggle with, okay, so how do I understand this? If I'm going to help, how can I help? I want to help, but I'm not really sure how to understand all these different implications of the pandemic. And so the way that I frame them in my own mind is kind of along the lines of adverse childhood experiences. So many of us have more experience with adverse childhood experiences or social determinants of health than we might with natural disasters. And so if we think of them in the sense of adverse childhood experiences, we can see this is a very nice ACEs connection. There's a slide resource that, again, you can use if you find this very helpful to understand adverse childhood experiences. For those of you who are not familiar, adverse childhood experiences are experiences that are usually happen between, it can be in the womb all the way really through adolescence. The initial famous study, which was in 1998, wasn't the first study, but it was the famous study, probably famous because it was done with Kaiser Permanente population in Southern California that was really white middle class. What they found was really the household. So number one in 1998 was really the focus of that study. And what they found in that study was that that children who had experienced 4 or more of these adversities in the household, such as a parent that was experiencing mental illness, somebody in the household was struggling with alcoholism or drug abuse, there was some sort of sexual or emotional, physical abuse of the children, somebody in the household was incarcerated, that they could literally load those into future health issues, behavior, mental, and physical health issues. It wasn't a correlation. We are also talk about correlation versus causation. It was a causation. It was directly loading into early death and some other things we'll mention in a few moments. Since 1998, people have been doing studies to find out what else is creating trauma. And average child experiences aren't necessarily automatically trauma. And we're going to talk about that. That's really important. So Patrick and I both experienced an average child experience. He might have a very different response than I do. And the researchers, we wonder why. And so we're going to talk about why that is later on, because that's so important to our work as family members, as educators, as community support, and collaborators. So since that time, since 1998, we've expanded it to know that there are community factors, often called social determinants of health, and environmental factors that also load into negative mental, physical health issues in the future. Some of these are racism. Racism leads to lower birth rate, lower access to healthcare, higher maternity death rates, all sorts of other negative outcomes of structural racism. So we know when we have substandard schools, we have substandard resources, that it will lead to future health issues of our kids. And that follows into our adulthood in the sense that we often have teachers who are working with our kids who also have experienced trauma. And so we need to make sure we're taking care of our adults that have experienced trauma as well. So we go to the next slide. You'll see that these, if you have 4 more ACEs, in addition to what you see here on the screen, we know that you're more likely to have 50 or more sexual partners. You're more likely to die in your 50s, more likely to have cancer, more likely to have mental health issues such as depression and anxiety, more likely to have COPD, interestingly enough. And so this has been called, and you see it on the screen, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health emergency and crisis facing the country today. So if we think about the pandemic, and the pandemic really focusing in on increasing the adversities, increasing inequity, increasing oppression, increasing violence against marginalized population and minoritized population, increasing the lack of access, then you can see how it really fits into a lens of adverse childhood experiences as a potentially traumatic event. The other thing that this is a really nice slide to show, and again, this is something that you can use, is that pyramid of what does this actually impact? And what we're learning is that it really changes our DNA. So when people experience adverse childhood experiences and they experience multiple traumas, it can not only change the neural pathways in their brain, but all the way down to the molecular level of their body. And then we're into a school setting where the teachers are asking somebody to just behave, just sit, just be still, just I don't know why you think that way. And literally their brain has changed, their DNA has changed. And so we need to change in the way that we're working to support our kids. This is another great canarratives.org is a website that says, please use our slides. So again, I encourage you to resource yourself through these slide decks. And I kind of mentioned this already, so I'm not going to reiterate this, just thought that you should have this slide to see kind of the way that adverse child experiences work as somebody experiences them. And then it goes into neurobiological, psychosocial impacts, which increase health risk behaviors, and then the long and short-term consequences, by the way. We also aren't going to mention, we don't have this in a slide deck, but the short-term consequences for kids are increased doctor visits, things that you would not be surprised at based on what I've already mentioned. So increased doctor visits, increased behavior issues in schools, and all sorts of other immediate issues. So we see adverse child experiences with immediate issues with our kids, and then long-term disease, disability, and social problems. There is good news. So the pandemic has happened. We know that our kids are experiencing increased anxiety and depression, stress, isolation, mental health issues, fear, withdrawal. So what do we do about that as community members? What do we do that as family members? What do we do that about school leaders? Like, we can do something, which is very exciting. So we can buffer the impact of the pandemic. And it's not actually very difficult, which is exciting. So there's two different lenses we're going to be looking at this through. One is called positive childhood experiences. Dr. Bethel is really the national leader in this work. Her description of it was feeling safe, basically. Being able to talk about emotions and things that are hard and feeling supported. So those are positive childhood experiences. We're also going to talk about this through the lens of protective factors. Protective factors have been researched far longer as a general psychology area, and its term is a little bit broader. A characteristic at the biological, psychological, family, or community level, and that's associated with lower likelihoods of problem outcomes. So basically, a buffer. A protective factor is going to be some sort of buffer to trauma in a general way. So what's the difference? Why do we have two different terms? Positive child experiences are directly loaded. The research directly loads them into buffering ACEs. Protective factors are more general into psychology. And there are other terms for assets and things that people can use to try to support student success. We look at particularly these two lenses because we know that they buffer the impact of trauma in particular and ACEs in particular. And when we think about all the things that the pandemic has brought to our kids and there's anxiety, depression, mental health issues, we want to be actively buffering those things, which we can do. So we take just a minute, and I'm only going to talk for about 10 more minutes about this, and we're going to, before we go in, let's have you participate here. So I know we have about 60, if we don't count us, the moderators and the presenters, 62 of us in this room. Let's have some people participate in the chat. What would you guess are positive childhood experiences that can buffer ACEs? What types of things do you think might be positive childhood experiences? Friendships, George, awesome, absolutely. Relationships, definitely Nicole. Positive role models, supportive families. You all are rocking and rolling. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, Jackie, way to bring grandparents. Definitely, definitely. Meals together, Farah. That's great. Yeah, routines are very important. Stable housing, supporting adults, daily needs met. Yeah, Maslow hierarchy needs before we get into other things. Great teachers. Interesting, Jackie. We'll see what the research says on that. School engagement. Supportive adults, specifically at school. Feeling loved. Awesome. I like this group here. This is fantastic. Patrick, let's see what we got from the research. Someone's like, let's come on down. How to have fun. Mary, you're talking my language right now. This is fantastic. So this is one study. This is just one study. This isn't all of them. But one study a few years ago found very similar things to what you all have written into the chat. So these 7 were positive childhood experiences that directly buffered ACEs. So there may be other things that are positive. That's not what we're saying. There's a lot of great assets, a lot of great things that are important. These 7 buffered adversity in childhood. So being able to talk to family about your feelings, feeling like your family is standing by you, participating in community traditions. I love this one. So number 3, The reason I love this one is if we often forget that we have a lot of family and community and school traditions that we participate in. And so we need to, if we just take a moment and reinforce those, then we can really buffer trauma. So think about, your Friday night football, your bands, your drama, your theater, the clubs at your school, your evening dinners together. What do you do for holidays? We're into Jewish holiday season right now. And so, are we celebrating Jewish holidays right now? Are we doing things that really involve our families into celebrating traditions with our school leaders? And how are schools emphasizing that? So we can buffer trauma just by being mindful about celebrating the traditions that we automatically participate in and making them things that we do intentionally and consistently. Feeling a sense of belonging in high school. A sense of school belonging is like a superpower. If kids feel belonging in school, they're going to be successful in school. So one of the things that we do as school counselors, we try to think about what should we be measuring? What should we be measuring in school? Well, one of the things we try to measure is school belonging because it is such a superpower. So if kids have low feelings of school belonging, yeah, Mary. So, think about that kid and how they feel. Do they want to come to school? So Mary's bringing up a point in the chat around bullying. We know that bullying and feeling unsafe in school, especially populations, LGBTQ plus populations, students of color in primarily white schools, they oftentimes using general language right now, oftentimes these populations feel unsafe at school and their attendance is lower because why would you want to go somewhere you feel unsafe? I don't know if any of you ever worked in a workplace where you felt unsafe. It's the worst feeling. You don't want to be there. Imagine our kids feeling that about their school. So they're not going to go. So if they feel like they're supported by friends, then they're going to be able to buffer trauma. By the way, this one is really important. If people have social networks, unfortunately, a lot of our adolescent females experience dating abuse of some kind, emotional, physical. We know that feeling supported by friends and being connected with relationships with others can buffer that trauma in a way that makes it not as long-lasting or detrimental. Unfortunately, it's still a trauma. Had these two non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in them. This word genuine is so important. Do we actually take the time? So this is beyond just knowing somebody's name. Do we ask them, how are you doing? Tell me what you did this weekend. What's important to you? What do you love? What do you enjoy doing? I think one of the things we do oftentimes to take a genuine interest in somebody, especially like a middle schooler, it's what do you want to be when you grow up? I think that's a trap. I think we want to avoid that and say, what do you love doing now? And then help them connect that to potential things they can do in the future. But I don't know if you remember when you were 13 and someone said, what do you want to do in the future? You're like, I really just don't know. That's scary. So feeling safe and protected by an adult in their home is another protective factor. So when you all commented in the chat, which I'm pointing at, you just crushed many of these and you identified many of these. So very well done. We're going to keep going. All right, so these are other ones from additional studies. You're going to see that they overlap. And one of the things that I'm going to want you to notice with positive childhood experiences and protective factors is they're relational. If we want to buffer trauma, we're going to need to deprioritize focusing entirely on content delivery in our schools and reprioritize the sense of relationship and community that schools can create for our kids and trust that the academic gains will follow, because they do. We know that they do. We have research that shows that they do. And so our academic gains will follow more quickly schools that create this really strong feeling of belonging and community and relationship between peers and adults and students. And we can, we can emphasize this by being a part of PTAs, by being a part of partnerships with schools, by being a part of school boards. Being elected to a school board is a really important leadership priority, not just have elected leaders up there, but have family members and community members on school boards. And we can reinforce these things to our school leaders and school leaders in the room. We can reinforce these things as priorities, knowing that if we build these very strong relationships and this community in our schools, that it leads to higher math and reading scores. So it leads to higher test scores. It leads to greater graduation rates. And if you like that research, Castle has it on their website, or you can reach out to us. We're happy to give you that research so that if you need something to take back to your school to prioritize these things without losing a focus on academics. We have that research. It's not an either or. It's a both. It's just, what are we prioritizing first? It needs to be this, especially in the pandemic. So we go to the next slide. I'm going to go through the next few slides relatively quickly because I want to be done my talk in about 8 minutes. Mary, just keep posting. I'm going to just jump right off of your comments. Yes, and it's also one of the things that I comment when I go to middle schools is like, this is where creativity goes to die. And unfortunately, a lot of middle school principals will agree with me. And the reason that is because that high stakes test scores get so serious in middle school. And oftentimes right before high school, everybody wants to start treating those kids like adults. It's even worse in high school. And they're like, everybody needs to be like adult modeling and kids are going to be role playing their adult selves. And that's true, but they're still adolescents until they're 25. So we probably need to give them time to play and give them time to explore and be creative. And so I think it's a real struggle for educators who want to create this place where kids have smiles on their faces all through the year. And where they are in a middle school that enhances creativity and helps them become the most creative, entrepreneur, thoughtful person they can possibly be, and the pressure that administrators and leaders and teachers feel around tests. And so there's this balance, this fight that's constantly going on for our educators that we can help inform when we bring in this type of research and support. So this slide and the next few slides, I'm not going to necessarily read verbatim because you all can read and you can download the slide deck and you can have them. But basically, the next few slides are going to show you the research that illustrates the impact of positive child experiences. So we know that positive child experiences lead to better health outcomes, better mental health outcomes, and better physical health outcomes. You can see that people are sleeping better, that their depression goes down, their stress goes down, and their anxiety goes down. I love, by the way, what PJ just posted. I think that really, if we just take away PJ's comment, PJ just built that middle schooler has a protective factor because of PJ. And that's if that's what people take away from the day, I would just have chills. Like, that is the biggest takeaway, is that it really is about people and relationships. And if that middle schooler shows up and PJ is there and gives her that safe place to be and grow who she is, then she's going to respond differently to the trauma of the pandemic than another middle schooler. So it's incredibly, I mean, we could stop talking, and if we just built on that, it would be, to me, a successful takeaway for the day. So thank you, PJ. What we're seeing in the slides is really the research illustration of what PJ is illustrating in the chat. Like, that middle schooler is probably going to have lower risks of depression, lower risks of anxiety, feel less stress, she obviously feels less isolation. If we go back to that isolation in the beginning, she doesn't feel isolated. She comes to school because she has that connection. And so this research that you're seeing is really just the outcomes of the relationships that we're talking about. Protective factors are going to be very similar. There are going to be more of them. Why are there more of them? Because they've been researched longer, so we have more time to look into them. So if we look at protective factors, even though we see many more of them on the next slide, you will see that they overlap with positive child experiences. Again, we're looking at those positive relationships between peers and adults and peers. Looking at one of the things that is tricky is that resilience, because oftentimes resilience and grit can be perceived I perceive them as the direct need created by a racist system. In other words, which kids are most likely to need resilience and grit? Our Black and brown kids. Why are our kids and our ELL kids and our special ed kids, why are these kids the ones that need resilience the most and grit? Because the system is not built for them and it oppresses them. And so when I see resilience, I get a little sad and I think, okay, what system do I need to attack so that my kids don't need the resilience to overcome the exact system that we've created? And so when you see resilience and grit and people are applauding them and saying, we're going to build resilience with these kids, I kind of want you to think, well, that's a white perspective. I want you to think that our Black and brown students have built-in resilience in their communities and in Black pride and in cultural pride for ELL students, and that it's our responsibility to raise that ability of pride and cultural pride. And so when I see resilience and grit, I think, which system do I need to attack right now? Because I don't want my kids needing resilience. I don't want them needing the same amount of grit, because not all kids have that. So when you think about self-efficacy, social emotional support from peers in class, all these things are the things that you already mentioned in the chat earlier. Thanks, Patrick. Lots of research outcomes for you to use so that you don't have to look up these research on your own. But again, you have citations at the bottom. You have things that you can cite if you want to take this and do your own presentation. Feel free to take the research that we spent time collecting for you so that you don't have to do that work. This research is really similar to positive childhood experiences. People are going to have better overall health. They're going to have better school success. They're going to buffer the mental health issues of trauma. We keep going. You're going to notice that, I did talk about some of the dating abuse with that social support and empathy. We did talk a little about resilience. There is research we probably need to add in here that Black identity and cultural pride also buffer mental health issues and issues created by systems. And so schools can really focus on enhancing that as well. We keep going. We have just, again, more of the research that we want you to use, and you can see which things load into buffering trauma. And so the protective adult relationships, the social bonds, having someone that you trust to talk to, all these things are going to lead to better outcomes.
All right, so that's a lot. And one thing that Dr. Z may have said explicitly, but I'll reiterate, each of these protective factors or each of these positive child experiences has its own dedicated line of research. So these are huge factors that are, very, very well supported and have a ton of information, strategies, and I mean, expansive. So like teacher-student relationships, we know that that's important. And if you were to do some research on teacher-student relationships, there would be an explosion of research because we can see why it's so important, and there's a lot of research on why it's important, how you can build it in schools, and all these different things. So each of these factors that we're addressing right now, they're huge, and the more that we can provide to students, the more effective we can all be together in collaboration with one another to build students, children, adolescents, protective factors, positive child experiences, so that they can more successfully navigate, if they're experiencing trauma or something like that. So we're going to change gears, and we're also going to have a break in about 10 minutes. And the break is going to be a 15-minute break, so we'll have a nice chunk of time to kind of refresh a little bit and jump back into what we're discussing here. We're also going to take a good amount of time in breakout sessions and work groups, trying to collaborate together, bounce ideas off of one another. So that's where we're headed with this presentation. But we're going to move now into the partnership aspect. So now we understand the problem. We understand what some of the solution involves, which are building protective factors, building positive childhood experiences. And now it's, how do we go about doing that in partnership with one another so that we can kind of wrap around children and adolescents to support them in building these protective factors and positive child experiences. So again, we know that protective factors are critical to student success. And if we're coming alongside one another, all students are going to benefit. So essentially with with the work that we've been doing in our research brief, we really tried to zero in and hone in on really specific protective factors that are very, very, very high impact. And so these actually, the factors that we selected fell into the categories of both protective factors and positive childhood experiences. So there is a lot of overlap between those two terms, and these are some high impact factors that fall into both of those terms. So we selected 5 high impact strategies, and we provided a brief summary of why they're important, and then also some strategies and opportunities that schools can use and that families can use to work alongside one another to build these factors in children and adolescents. So we're going to take just a few minutes here to quickly go over each of the 5, and then we're going to spend some time in breakout groups, really diving in conversation with one another and looking at opportunities, things that we're already doing in schools to help build these, things that we can do in schools. Maybe you'll learn from other people in your groups, or other, family members, community members, so that we can collaborate with one another and explore different ideas of ways that we can kind of dive into these and support students. So we're going to start off by going through these strategies. Farah, if you wouldn't mind too, I don't know if you've done it, but can you reshare the research brief link again in the chat? Because again, this is where
Yes.
these are coming from. Thanks, Farah. These are coming from the research brief that we developed over the past few months. So the first one that we're going to talk about is building supportive relationships at home. And interestingly enough, when you hear that supportive relationships at home are very important, on the school side, we might think, okay, cool, that has nothing to do with us. We're not home, right? So, on the school side, we can focus on what the school is doing. We don't need to focus on what's happening in the home. And research suggests that's not necessarily true. There are things that schools are doing that can promote positive relationships at home, and there are things that schools can do that can hinder positive relationships at home. So really, it comes down to taking an inventory of our practices as schools. What are we as a school community doing that are we making positive phone calls home, or are we only calling home or contacting home when we are seeing what we view as problems? So that's just one small example, but the vast majority of schools aren't making a practice of making positive phone calls home regularly. And those negative phone calls home can really disrupt things that are going on at home between the child and their family. So, instead of just focusing on the negative, how can we build in some of these positive things at home? So there's a lot of different strategies, a lot of different opportunities. I'm not going to read through each one of them verbatim right now, because we are going to have time to dive into these opportunities in the breakout rooms. But go ahead, read through some of these opportunities right now, but also share in the chat. What are some things that you think that schools can do from the school perspective to help build positive relationships at home, or to support positive relationships at home? So what are some things that you all are seeing that schools can do to help really build these relationships at home? Feel free to type some in the chat. I love that. Beth, thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree. Celebrating family differences all year long, not just on holidays. And that's, that's such a big thing. And I think that really ties in well with the first point that we have there of just adopting a strengths-based approach to family engagement. Because a lot of times we really are focused mostly on, this is what we do as a school, this is what you do as families, and we're trying to, we view families as groups that need things from us as a school, but families are, if we're viewing them as strength-based and we're celebrating differences and we're celebrating all that families have to offer, that's such an important thing. Communicating with families, yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of this too comes down to trust. How can we build trust between schools and families? Great. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one, just for the sake of time, and we're going to take a break in just a couple of minutes. So the next one, engaging families in nurturing teacher-student relationships. So again, the protective factor, the positive childhood experience here that we're naming is teacher-student relationships, but also, our focus is on partnerships. So what is the role of families in that? And how can we build partnerships between families and schools around teacher-student relationships? So we have some ideas here. And some of them are simply just auditing staff and supports that are in place within schools to help support mental health. Looking at things like restorative practices, and not just building restorative practices at school, but also sending home resources around restorative practices so we can build those at home as well. And I think another really important factor here too, on the family side, families play an important role in teacher-student relationships, right? On the family side, if families are, constantly, speaking dismissively about teachers, or speaking dismissively about the school, or complaining, or things like that at home, then that probably is going to impact the relationship between the student and the child. So the relationship does go both ways. And so it's really important that we are looking at this issue together as a community. All right, I think we're going to talk about one more before we have a break here in a minute. The next one is ensuring that home and school routines and rituals support stability and sense of identity. So this protective factor, this positive child experience, is really focused on routines and rituals, things that create stability. Those are the things like routines. And then the rituals are things that create meaning. So it's not just, focusing on what can we do to line things up in a row, because, stability, structure, that helps to create a really important sense of predictability and stability for children and adolescents. And that's really, really important. But it's also important that we're doing things like rituals, things that create meaning. And it could be small things that happen over the course of a week or the course of a day, moment to moment, but building some ritual, building some opportunities within the school day, at home, that are creating meaning for a child or adolescent. That's also really important. And there's so many different ways that we can go about building those partnerships. I'm not able to, there's been a lot of stuff happening in the chat. Dr. Z, is there anything to highlight from the chat that you're seeing here?
Yeah, all of it, Patrick. So I think that you keep going towards the break, but people are putting incredibly practical extensions of what you're saying, and giving personal examples and giving suggestions that they've made at schools. So I think people are reading the chat, and it's been a great connector from what you're saying with theory and research to practice that they're already doing.
Yeah.
Or
great.
Ideas.
So the next thing that we have coming up here is the break. And, again, we're going to take a 15-minute break, but I think the heart of what's happening in the chat is what we are really excited about for the breakout rooms that we're going to, that you'll be going into after we're done talking about the 5 strategies. So keep thinking about it, write down some ideas as they're coming along to you, because we really want to take that energy into the chat where you all can speak with one another, and we can together as a community build some really great ideas about how we can support students in this, and also then what we can do to help support you in supporting students in this. So we're going to take just a 15-minute break right now. We'll come back at around 2 o'clock, and then we'll continue this work. So thank you all for all that you've been sharing so far today.
Thanks, Patrick. And if people, I think I'm going to take a quick 5-minute break, but if people have questions and stuff that don't want the full 15 minutes, you can put it in the chat and we can banter with you while we take the 15-minute break, if you're interested in that.
Agreed. Yeah. So I'm going to step away for just a couple of minutes as well, but then I'll be back to answer any questions or keep talking. All right, everyone. Well, again, thanks for sticking with us. I know this is a longer workshop, but we're really excited to continue and move toward the collaborative part of the session. So before I jump into the final 2 strategies that we identified, the final 2 protective factors that we identified, I just want to take a quick second to talk about something I've been thinking about since we've been having this conversation. I think in my experience in schools, one thing that I've noticed is that it's really easy for the narrative within schools to, within members of the school community to get really, really focused on the barriers, right? So like there's a lot of things that we're up against when we're trying to build partnerships, or there's a lot of things we're up against when we're trying to support students. Things like, I don't know, like issues with social media, or like large societal issues, or things in the community like homelessness. Like there are a lot of barriers, or a lot of big barriers, and those are things that I think we can spend a lot of time in education really focused on these barriers. And I want to challenge us. And I think one thing that's really exciting about this work specifically is that this work is really, it's not, I mean, yes, we recognize that those barriers exist, and that we have a role in addressing systemic barriers, especially things that we are contributing to as a school community. At the same time, these protective factors, these positive child experiences, these are things that we can do. Like, we know that these things work. And if we are spending time and we're putting our energy toward these things rather than just focusing and talking over and over and over again about the barriers, I think we'll see a lot of really, really positive outcomes for students. So I think that's what's exciting, rather than just always focusing on the barriers and the things that are creating issues. I think, putting our energy in a positive direction toward things like protective factors and promotive factors and positive childhood experiences can be really, really fruitful. So with that, unless you have anything to add, Dr. Saranovski? No. All right, we will continue forward here with the final two strategies. So strategy 4, we're focused on sense of belonging. And as Dr. Saranovski already mentioned earlier, a sense of school belonging is a superpower. It's an incredibly, incredibly important factor for our students. And so, how can we come alongside families as schools? How can we come alongside them to help promote a sense of school belonging? And there's so much that we can do. One thing that's really closely tied to this is extracurricular activities, right? So it's, schools offer so much more than academics. Schools offer a place for, community. It's for community to be formed and built, and for kids to explore different parts of themselves and interests and hobbies and all these different things. And so we need to be creative and be creative alongside families to figure out ways to encourage kids and adolescents to figure out ways to seek out or pursue their interests and pursue things that they can come alongside other students to build a community. But there's also, sense of school belonging, like Dr. Saranovski was mentioning earlier. It also has to do with who are the teachers. Are the teachers representative of the students? Do the students feel like they can have a connection to the teachers in the building? That's a really, really big thing, is teachers, faculty members, school counselors. What is the racial and ethnic makeup of our school community, the leaders in our school, and what is the racial and ethnic makeup of our student body? Do they reflect each other? Typically, we see no, not often. And that can be a big barrier. And so, what can we do as school leaders in our hiring practices and things like that too? So there's a lot to unpack here with school belonging. So I'm going to leave it there for now, but hopefully we'll have some time to dive into this in a little bit as well. And the last one is promoting problem solving and self-regulation skills at home and in school. And this one, when we're talking about problem solving skills and self-regulation skills, really the word that we're looking at here is executive functioning or executive functions. And we try to avoid that language because it can be really researchy and it can be hard to wrap our brains around. But essentially what we're talking about is, problem solving skills and self-regulation skills. And there's so much research on how schools and families can build this at home and in schools, but then also really, how that serves as a protective factor for kids against things like trauma and adverse child experiences and things like that. So one thing I just encourage you, again, I'm going to kind of leave it there for now, but I would really encourage you to take a look at the research brief and to click on some of these resources, especially things like the Center for the Developing Child, because they have really tremendous resources for schools and for families around building executive functions, problem-solving skills, self-regulation skills. So I would really encourage you to look there. All right, so what we're going to do now, sorry, before I move over, anything in the chat, because I was not looking at the chat at all. Anything to highlight right now from the chat?
A lot of additional great contributions around the focus for schools to really talk about solutions instead of problems. Mary brought up a great point about, athletics are a great connector of people, but then sometimes students are cut off of teams when their grades aren't high enough. So maybe if schools are thinking about sports as more than sports and as a way for them to feel like they belong, Amanda just put an opportunity that schools could do to require athletes to participate in study groups. And, also universities, colleges have club athletics too and other athletics. But I think the point in the chat that for me is emerging is, athletics are an avenue to more than just athletics. They're an avenue to higher grades. They're an avenue to school belonging. They're an avenue to peer connection. And so how can schools intentionally bolster that in addition to Friday Night Lights,
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, great point. All right, so we're going to move now into the breakout session, and I just want to explain how that will work. So in a minute, we're going to give you a link that's going to take you to a resource that we've developed for you around the research brief. So essentially, this document, it's going to ask you to make a copy of it. So when you click on the link, it's going to automatically have you make a copy. So that will be your independent copy for you to keep. You can use it again. You can access it, and you can work on developing and filling it out with other members of your school community. If you're interested in diving into any of these topics. But each of the strategies, if you can see my screen, each of the strategies has its own tab down at the bottom. So strategy 1 is here, and then we listed all the opportunities for schools around these topics. And there's a place where you can check off if it's been maybe not started yet, in progress, completed. You can take notes in this tool on next steps, and you can also designate a person responsible. So again, this is a tool that's meant for you to go through as a team, maybe with other members of your school community or other family members. So you can start having a conversation around building these protective factors within your school communities. And again, you can just simply navigate to the next one by down at the bottom. There's a tab, different tabs for strategy 2 and 3, 4, and 5. So what we're going to do in a minute is I think the link was already dropped in the chat, but you can navigate there. We're going to break out into small groups. And what we'll do is we're going to give you 30 minutes to just talk through them. And I'll share the talking points in a minute. But we really just want you to have a dialogue. You can start filling this out independently if you want, just start thinking about where you are within your school community on some of these things. But I want you to focus on 2 of the strategies. I'll put this in the chat as well. But we're going to focus on strategy 2 for now, just because there's not going to be enough time to go through all of these in 30 minutes. We'll focus on strategy 2, and then if you have time, then we'll focus on strategy 4. So the 2 we'll focus on are the teacher-student relationships and sense of belonging in schools. So I'll put that in the chat as well, so you'll navigate to there. But really, we want you to have a conversation in your groups. So the conversation will be, you'll talk about, you'll kind of go down the list and just talk through some of those opportunities. And in your small groups, is anyone already utilizing this strategy? Does anyone have any additional strategies or plans in their school or their district to help support this specific opportunity that you're talking about? What does or what would this look like in your building or district? So really just a focused conversation around implementing and sustaining these different strategies in your district. So you can just go through each of them and have a conversation. What could this look like? What does this look like? What are we already doing? What might we do? And hear from each other. And you can start filling it out if you want. But again, really, it's supposed to be a time to have a conversation with one another. We'll come back and, after about 30 minutes, and we'll Dr. Saranovski and I are going to jump into different rooms and hear from you all and reflect with you as you're going through this. But you can pace yourself. And again, you'll focus on strategy 2 and strategy 4 if you have time for it. And then we'll come back together again and reflect on different ideas or different things that we have heard from one another. Anything to add, Dr. Saranovski?
Farrah and I have been trying to capture everything you've been saying in the chat. So yeah. I've been thinking about adding anything, but I've been trying to think about capture everything. But I just appreciate the comments from Beth and Maria and others that they're already finding this document useful. That's all our wish for you. And the other, one of the things I would add, I guess, I always have something to add. What I would add is this isn't just, we've already talked about this extensively in the chat. There are probably many things in this document that we could do in our homes. Yeah. In our communities, in our workplaces, if we're not in schools. So also think in that terms as well. Like, what can I do? What can I do at home? What can we do together? Yeah. If you're in an educational building, awesome. What can you do there? But also, how can you involve families? How can you involve the community in this work?
Right. And these strategies, the one that we pulled out from the research brief, are really, these are the opportunities for schools specifically, like you're talking about, Dr. Z. But in the research brief also, right below it, are opportunities for families. So we also did share ideas for families directly there too. So again, we're excited for you to talk with one another, and we're excited to hear from you all on the ideas that you have. So we'll go ahead and break out into rooms now. We'll stay in this main room for just a few minutes in case there are technical issues, and then we'll join you in your breakout rooms as we can.
And tell me again how long we're going to be in our breakout rooms?
We'll do it for about 30 minutes, maybe. It might run a little bit shorter than that. So between 25 minutes, 30 minutes.
So we'll probably come back around 2:40.
Yeah, we'll come back around 2:40.
All right, we're going to get him set up. Here we go, everyone.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the main room. All right, so welcome back, everybody. Everybody is the rooms have been closed, maybe even in mid-sentence, and you got cut off, hopefully because you're having such a rich conversation. But welcome back to the main room. Patrick and I initially jumped into a couple of rooms and then realized all we were doing was interrupting your flow. And so we really appreciate that fantastic conversations that were occurring when we went in and out of rooms, and we want to bring it back here to the whole group. So if you could hang with us for just another about 15 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up, and we'll probably start wrapping up in around 12 to 15 minutes. So we're going to do the popcorn, and if you don't know what room you're in, that's okay, because I'm going to tell you what room you're in when we popcorn it around. But what we want to know is, when you think about your breakout room discussion and that rich discussion that occurred, it was fantastic when I popped in, and I didn't want to interrupt because it was so good. So if you were going to provide like a 30-second takeaway for those that were not with you in that room, what is your 30-second takeaway from this conversation and the richness of what you all discussed? So that may be a challenge, so I'll give you like a minute to think about it before we call out randomly a group. But again, the question is, if you were to provide a 30-second synopsis, a takeaway from your time with the group, what would that be? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to start by randomly calling on a group. Anyone from the group can talk, multiple people, and then we will popcorn to another group. We have 12 groups. And so thanks, Patrick, for putting that in there. So let's see. I see Marion right there in front of me. Will you type in the chat a number between 1 and 12, any number? I'm trying to choose someone that doesn't have all the names of the people in there, so it is truly random. So a number between 1 and 12. 4. All right, 4. That is Lisa, Mary, PJ, and Sharonda. What is your, and you can unmute, please, for sure. What was your 30-second synopsis, or what do we need to know about your discussion?
I'll say Rhonda, that it's so true that engagement is important with, or building relationships is important to create engagement and help students learn, as well as working with the family. So we had a lot of wonderful people who are kind of similar, I guess, in what they do, and they get those special one-on-ones and get to really see students for their skills and strengths versus the labels that they have. And then the other takeaway that we, for our own selves, is the self-care.
Oh, love it. Thank you.
Also, the attachment of students with all of the school support staff, administration, teachers, cooks, all of them, to have that relationship. So it's more of we're all together here. We're all a family here.
I love it. I'm trying to capture in just brief statements in the chat this important things that you're sharing. I really appreciate your conversation. It's really rich.
And just like Sharonda mentioned, it's ironic. This is her day off and she's still making herself available to her students. She's driving, picking up her son or brother, and she still has probably her email available to her students. But to always make yourself available to your students and to let them feel heard, because I feel like the teachers are so rushed with their schedule. They have to, cover so much material in such a short period of time that they don't have the time to connect with the students. And so as a liaison myself, I feel like that's part of my job, to get to know the students on a more individual basis. And like I mentioned in our group breakout session, we had the first 2 weeks of our school year was just strictly devoted. Our principal advised the staff just to get to know the students for the first 2 weeks. Don't worry about the material. Don't cover, any assignments, but just to know them more on an individual, basis, so that you can connect with those students and the students can connect with one another.
That's amazing. I love that. And that is going to have so many implications down the line. And I think one of the things that we talk about in counseling a lot is the ripple effect. People have been messaging me about working with trauma, and when you work with things that are so overwhelming, like the pandemic, people often feel overwhelmed about where do you start? And you just start. You just do exactly what you just said. You start with building those connections, focusing on students, focusing on relationships. Those are going to create ripples across the rest of the school year for your students. That's incredibly powerful. So thank you for that. And I know we may not have heard from everyone from your group, but that's fantastic. I'm just thinking about time. Will you give us the next number between 1 and 12? Obviously not 4. So between 1 and 12, but not 4.
10. That's my favorite number.
All right. Room 10 is Emily, Leah, Stephanie, and Stephanie.
I think one of the things we talked about was the gift of the pandemic in some of our connections with families that, we talked about special ed or ESL and the ability to connect with them in their homes via Zoom and things like that. But also now the challenge of Zoom, that parents, for a variety of reasons, are able to do that from home and are much more likely to choose that option rather than coming into a building. And the other thing we talked about, was the multiple hats of individuals trying to facilitate all of this. And let's jump into.
Thank you, Leah. Anybody else from that group want to share? We'll pop over to maybe one more group before we ask a different question.
No, I think she covered a lot of what we talked about and kind of the essence of it. So thank you. Sure.
Since you talked, Emily, you get to choose the next number, though.
I set myself up, didn't I?
Well, yeah, it's not high pressure, though.
That's okay. We're going to go with number 5.
Number 5. All right. Room 5. Lynn and Rachel. Were you all in room 5?
I think so, but it might just be me.
Oh, if you're ready to represent, great. If you don't feel comfortable, you can just pop another number. Totally up to you.
I think it depends on the question.
The question was, well, let's shift questions since we've got about 4 more minutes. So since it's just you, was there anything in those strategies and opportunities that felt like they resonated with you or felt like they were attainable?
We talked about how we liked a lot of them, and just some of the challenges with connecting with families with the internet, and like how Facebook has been a blessing and a curse. And that the one with the text messaging we talked a little bit about, and how that is kind of like new age technology to communicate with families and how that can be tough. But there was a lot of them that we liked, and just kind of talk through some of the challenges and maybe getting them started and off the road.
I love that. And I think one of the things that I was hearing your group do, and each of the groups have really illustrated, is one of the things that I teach my students is never go to an administrator with a problem. Go to the administrators with the solutions. So there's a challenge. I love the way you called it a challenge, Rachel. Like there's these challenges, but here's 5 things we could try. And so I appreciate that not just you, Rachel, but every single group that has really shared has offered challenges, but then offered multiple strategies for maneuvering around those challenges. So I love it. So Patrick just invited you to share in the chat your takeaways. I think that's, if we could spend like 2 or 3 minutes, because then we'll kind of close it up. 2 or 3 minutes sharing in the chat. What were your takeaways? What did you think was attainable? What did you find valuable? And then here's our final question. Do you have any recommendations for us as we start to develop resources and support around this? So I'm going to put that in there. Any recommendations for us?
I already put it in there.
Oh, thanks. What Patrick wrote. That's our final question for you. So I'm going to be quiet for about 2 minutes, and then we'll do a final synopsis and takeaway, and Farrah will close it all down for us.
And as you're typing too, I'm just going to share as well. I have on the slide our email addresses, and like Dr. Saranovski just said, we're working. Our work around this through the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center is not over yet. We're just starting in a lot of ways. So we would love to hear from all of you, or any of you, or partner with you if you are really interested in this work, especially as we continue to build resources directly for schools, directly for families, because we want to try to take this information right now, the way it stands is kind of information, and we want to help make it practical and useful for schools and for families. So if you have any thoughts, or if you want to partner around this, feel free to reach out to us as well. We'd really be excited to hear from you and continue the conversation outside of this as well.
And please don't leave yet. I know that we're kind of winding down as we're doing this, but the reason I say that is because I think Farrah has some housekeeping stuff for you. So I know we're starting to, a lot of times the last stuff in the chat is kind of like the thanks, see you later, have a good weekend stuff. Farrah's got a few things for you before you go. Farrah, you might want to introduce that as people are processing their takeaways.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say a few words to everyone. First of all, definitely want to say thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Dr. Saranovski. So happy to have you today. Thank you for sharing your time, knowledge with us today. And I dropped a link in the survey, or excuse me, a link in the chat to a survey. Please be sure to take that. We ask that you only take it once. It will be used to administer contact hours. So it's critical that you take the survey if you are seeking credit. Also, Please feel free to continue all the conversations on social media. We're using the hashtag Breakthrough22. So let's keep the conversations going. As early as next week, you can visit the Ohio Family Engaged website for all of today's information, recordings to every session, copies of slides that you can download. So look for that next week on the website. I'm going to drop that in chat right now too. So please feel welcome and joining me to thank Patrick and Dr. Saranovski for being here today. Feel free to unmute or add a note in chat to thank them. And we'll end the session here in just a moment.
And we do have a few extra minutes here too at the end. So, feel free to ask any questions that you may have. You can unmute and talk as well. So we'll stick around for a few more minutes here as you're wrapping things up.
Farrah, may I ask you a question?
Sure, George.
Early on, when we first started, and Dr. Boone had put in after the first presenter presented, and they put it in the chat, and I filled it out at that time, but I've been then going the rest of the day. Will that interfere with hours, or what would be your suggestion?
It would not interfere with hours. Okay, so you didn't indicate what sessions you were present for, or did you indicate what sessions you were going to be present for?
No, I didn't.
Why don't you do it again, George? And I'll make a note that you're going to do it a second time. Does that sound all right?
That sounds wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome so much.
And folks, thank you so much. This was great. Appreciate it.
That's great to hear. Thank you for being here, George.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to close the room, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and making this a very successful 3rd annual Leadership Summit. We appreciate you. Have a great weekend. Bye, Patrick and Dr. Saranovski.